Yeah, we talk each other.
Yeah. Nice to see you again.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, it's good.
And Pia, if you want a hashtag, you can use gauged econ in case people are following. If people are live, if it's live streaming and you want them on Twitter, well, you can announce that you have a hashtag gauged econ, and then anybody who wants to tweet about it can tweet.
I'm live now. Okay.
Hmm?
Now, I'm the chair of this morning this morning, these talks will be structured essentially as a joint presentation between Pia Malaney, who will speak first, who is an INET grantee, and then when she concludes her part of the presentation, there'll be opportunity for questions relating to the material covered so far. And then this will be followed by Eric Weinstein, who's a research fellow at the Mathematical Institute in Oxford and a managing director at Teal Capital in San Francisco. So it's my pleasure to invite Pia Malaney to the podium now to present her talk from neoclassical mechanics to economic field theory.
Thank you. Morning. I've entitled my talk today From Neoclassical Mechanics to Economic Field Theory, and it's based on joint work that Eric and I started doing maybe 15 years ago that ran into a bit of a political problem. We stopped working on it for a little while and fortunately have had the chance to come back to it. I will talk a little bit about the conceptual... See if is that better? Okay, thanks. I will talk a little bit about the conceptual underpinnings of the work, and then Eric is going to pick up and talk more about the technical aspects. And when we stop for questions, Eric and I can both take questions, since this really is work that we've both developed together. So I want to start by thinking a little bit about when we talk about new economic thinking, is there a mathematics that we can think of that goes along with new economic thinking? As background, when Eric and I started working on this, I was a graduate student in the economics department. And as we started talking, we realized that some of the concepts that I was working with in economics mirrored some of the concepts that Eric was dealing with in mathematical physics. And we started thinking about how to bring the two fields together. And as we did, we realized, as we went deeper and deeper into this, that there is an underlying mathematical structure that fits so beautifully with economics that as we think about moving into new economics, the question is there a mathematical structure that one can think of as being appropriate for the new economics that we would like to be developing? And if there is, what would some of the characteristics be of this new mathematical structure? So the first question we want to ask is, we have this highly developed neoclassical economic theory. How will our new mathematical thinking coexist with the successes and the failures of old economic thinking or of neoclassical theory? Will we have to throw out everything we know already, or will they manage to merge together so that we can actually use some of the ideas from neoclassical thinking? As economists who have an interest in heterodox views, all of us are aware of the criticisms of physics envy that economics faces. And there is this question as we look forward, will we be looking more to biology, to the more behavioral approaches that are being taken, or will we be more reliant on the Samuelson-style neoclassical physics. Another issue that heterodox theories have faced is that very often we have one-off criticisms of the unified structure of neoclassical economics. And it, I think, has been a little bit of a problem because we have this giant edifice of neoclassical thinking, and while we come up with issues with various aspects of it, in the absence of a unified framework, it's been hard for us to actually go up against this very highly developed structure. So the question is, as we think about a new framework, will it be more unified or will it also be more scattered like heterodox insights? Neoclassical economics tends to give us very strong political conclusions. And I know for scientists, this has often been something of an issue, as the feeling is that the models are not necessarily strong enough to warrant the kind of, the strength of the conclusions that economists are drawing from our models. So when we develop our new framework, are we going to come up with conclusions that are at least as strong as neoclassical economics? And then, of course, there is the criticism that the mathematics that has been used in neoclassical economics has been increasingly complicated, and that the complications tend to obfuscate what we as economists are actually trying to achieve and what our political agenda is. So as we talk about introducing new mathematics, is it also going to be very complicated? Is it going to be intimidating? Or will it be more conceptual and welcoming? Now, of course, we haven't developed this foundation fully. From where we are now, as we look forward to a new mathematical framework, can we guess what it will be centered around? Can we guess what its foundations are going to look like, even though we haven't fully completed the program? So let me start by talking about what we see as some of the issues with old economic thinking. We are often accused of economic imperialism, and the belief is that we're looking at a system that is static, homogeneous, path-independent, and certain. And these are the assumptions that we're often forced to just confront as being put out there that we don't have very many choices about. Take, for example, this famous quote of Gary Becker from 1976. The combined postulates of maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and market equilibrium applied relentlessly and unflinchingly form the heart of the economic approach as I see it. It's just there. That's what it is. Deal with it. He is even more specific when he talks about changing preferences in this quote from Becker and Stigler, where he claims, tastes neither change capriciously nor differ importantly between people. On this interpretation, one does not argue over tastes, for the same reason that one does not argue over the Rocky Mountains. Both are there, will be there next year too, and are the same to all men. So if we have questions about what are the assumptions that we're working with, let's think about what are the mathematics of old economic thinking based on the thinking of Becker and Stigler. Well, one of them is that homogeneity plays a very important role. We tend to like static markets, static consumers. There is a tremendous amount of certainty. We don't think about things in terms of probability clouds. It's just much more easy to work with models that have certainty built into them. Path independence is important. Path independence is important. We don't really know how to deal with path dependence. And we assume that consumers are rational, both over time and spaces of choices. So as we start thinking about building a new mathematical framework, how do we feel about these assumptions? If these are the assumptions of old economic thinking, we want to develop a new framework, are we going to have to throw these out if we want to get to something that makes more sense? Well, the claim that Eric and I would make is that we would like to develop a system where each of these can be seen as degenerate special cases of relaxed assumptions. If we can relax our assumptions of homogeneity, static preferences, certainty, we can move to a system where we can think of each of these as a special case. So in our new economic thinking, we'd like to think of moving from certainty to uncertainty, to thinking about things in terms of probability clouds rather than certainty points. We'd like to move from static consumers, from static markets, from static preferences to dynamic, from representative agents to allowing for heterogeneity, from path independence to path dependence, and from rationality, this assumption that we never want to touch in our neoclassical framework, to actually allowing for behavioral and biological influences on agents. And from being unidirectional to being reflexive. So the claim is that if we can develop a framework where we can have each of these things, we can always see certainty as the degenerate case of uncertainty. It simplifies to just one point in our uncertainty space. Static preferences as being a degenerate case of dynamic. Same for all of these. Representative agents as being just one example of a heterogeneous agent, all the way down. So when we started to talk about this, I mentioned I was coming from an economics department and Eric was coming from a math department. And we started seeing these similarities in some of the structures that we were dealing with. And interestingly, as we started thinking about it, we felt that just like the monolith from 2001 Space Odyssey, we were finding these structures in many different places cropping up in ideas that we were talking about with our math friends, with our economist friends, with our biology friends, with our physics friends. And specifically, what are the structures that I'm referring to? In economics, it is the most basic structures of income effects and substitution effects. And so our first step was to realize that there is an analog when you get to differential geometry, where you're looking at vertical subspaces and horizontal subspaces. And once you find that you can move between these two, then you actually find that you can start using some of the tools of differential geometry to look at some of the issues in economics. Interestingly, though, we found that we can also start seeing it in biology. The analog in biology to an income effect would be fitness and improvements in fitness. And the analog to substitution effects would be drift. So you can think of drift as moving along an indifference curve and fitness as pushing you up to higher indifference curves in your welfare function. Physicists might think of this as internal quantum numbers and gauge potential. So let me start by talking about this a little bit in the context of the economics, which is where Eric and I began. So we started thinking about the index number problem, the issue that if you look at the Laspers index and the Pasch index designed to look at GDP growth or inflation over time, with the Laspers, you're looking at a basket from a previous time and you're evaluating it at current time prices to try and see what the changes in prices or quantities or welfare are. In the case of the Pasch index, you're looking at a current time basket and you're going back in time and evaluating it at prices from a previous time. And what you find, obviously, is that the two do not mesh. So we have what is known of as the index number problem. Well, so what we found was that if you start thinking about this in terms of connections and in terms of differential geometry, you can take your space of goods. In this case, we have a two-good situation, good 1 and good 2. And you can divide it into subspaces. So if Q is a basket of two goods, you can divide your space into your one-dimensional basket and an n-1 dimensional subspace, which I've called beta sub p. Beta sub p represents all possible barters. So it represents all trade-offs within a current pricing system, within whatever pricing system one is in, where the value of your basket is 0. And what you find then is if you take any vector, any basket, you can decompose your basket into a projection onto your basket Q and a trade or a barter that has 0 value. So whatever the size of your vector is, you can have that vector expressed as a multiple of Q, a multiple of your original basket, and some barter, some trade that has 0 value. And what you find then is, while in our original version we were taking just our basket Q and we were forcing the basket Q through time and evaluating it at different prices, in this situation you can take your basket Q and you can allow for substitutions in your basket without actually changing the value of the basket, because at any given time you're only allowing for changes by barters, the value of which are 0 at any given time. So in terms of thinking of this with respect to our old economics and our new economics, we can define it as being 2 natural connections. A trivial connection, which allows no change, you're simply taking your basket from one time to another, and a connection that allows changes by substitution effects. What happens is, if you allow changes by substitution effects, you are forcing your basket to be economically constant, but you're allowing for changes in the contents of the basket. So when you switch from the former to the latter, what happens is you eliminate the index number problem for differentiable models.
Nice idea to say that you have some economic constant. How do you define constant? How do you define the matter? And as you say, as
yes, because the wonderful thing about economics is that we have a natural metric provided for us by the market. So at any given time, you have market prices available. So for your consumer who's in the market, they have the choice as to what they want to consume, and they're allowed to make any trades given whatever the market prices are at that period of time.
Okay, so this is your base assumption. So the whole theory works
provided you have markets and prices. We can come back to it later. The point is really that. Sure. So the whole point is that in a market, you have prices that are given by the market. So to the extent one is trying to track inflation, you are allowing your consumer to take advantage of market prices to actually show you what their preferences are, and you're allowing for substitution in the basket at any given time based on what the consumer is capable of doing with an income held constant given market prices. Okay. I want to shift now to talking a little bit about biology and how we might see this play out in biology. This is a picture of a dung beetle. Dung beetles are found all over the world, and I'm going to talk about the very romantic mating rituals of the dung beetle, so called because they survive on feces, either partially or wholly. And as a result, this is the scarce resource, and this is the constraint that dung beetles are working with. The males use it to court females. The females will lay their eggs in the dung often, or have balls stored in their tunnels. And because it's such a precious resource, there are often battles amongst male dung beetles for this resource. And what we find, therefore, is that these beetles have evolved many different ways to defend their resources. In this particular species, we have them developing horns from the front of their faces. The interesting thing that was found by scientists is that as they studied 10 different species of these dung beetles, they found that there was a negative, that there was an inverse correlation between the size of the horn and the copulatory organ. So as these creatures are evolving, it would appear that they are facing a very strict budget constraint. Literally, the two of them, I think they added them up and they found that the size stays the same. So this looks very much like the kind of budget constraints that we draw in economics. And this leads us to think in terms of an indifference curve, which represents drift. As you move along the indifference curve, you're not necessarily improving your fitness, but anytime you can move to a higher indifference curve, if you can shift your budget constraint, you're moving to a higher level of fitness. And of course, this is remarkably like the picture we draw for humans. Now, the thing that I want to point out, for those of you who are familiar with Solarite's adaptive landscape, where he is talking about either phenotypes or alleles, but the hope is to create some kind of model which we can mathematize and where we can actually calculate fitness and how we can move to our higher fitness landscape. The interesting thing is when we look at this in biology, we're often forced to look at it as a heuristic. This is because we don't really have a metric, and within biology, these constraints often exist as combinatorial factors in the genetics and the epigenetics. The interesting aspect of economics is that if you assume you have a creature and you can take some of these traits, or you can take these choices, and you can shift them from being obligate, the way it is in a dung beetle, evolution in a dung beetle, to being facultative, the way it is with humans, where we can actually choose how we want to select between our resources. And if one can then put a metric on it, we're suddenly in a system where we actually do have access to being able to do mathematics on this. So the claim that we would like to make is that economics is really in a unique position to draw on biology and economics. And when we traditionally think of where economists have placed themselves, we have the neoclassical economists who tend to draw very strongly on physics, a la Samuelson. We have the behavioral economists who focus more on behavioral aspects like Kahneman and Tversky. And then we see ourselves really as being derivative of these fields. What we would like to believe is that if you look a little bit behind that, you can see physics as really being derivative of geometric dynamics, a field of mathematics. You can see all biology as being derivative of selection. And rather than seeing economics as being derivative of either physics or biology, we can think of economics as taking its place as a sibling to both physics and biology, where the idea is that we really have something to contribute to each of these fields, given our unique ability to be able to take the biology and put a metric on it, allowing us to actually use our physics models. So then we want to ask the question, is there a new marginal revolution? Most of us are familiar with the original marginal revolution in economics, which allowed us to start thinking in terms of differential calculus. Is there a new marginal revolution behind new economic thinking? And the claim we would like to make is that new economic thinking is likely to be about dynamic geometric fields, that we're going to have to start thinking in terms of fields rather than the points that we've been thinking about, or the two-dimensional spaces. Fields are about bundles and differential operators, and that we need dynamic fields for two different reasons. If we want to deal with heterogeneous populations, we can think in terms of classical fields. And if we want to deal with uncertainty, we can start thinking in terms of probability clouds. And the question is, does this make sense? So to speak to my question about, is this going to get us to mathematics that is even more complicated and difficult to access, or is this something that we can actually make accessible and welcoming? As a non-economist, when I think about gauge theory, I think about when we introduced the original marginal revolution using differential calculus, we thought about calculus as being the rise over the run, except that the reference set was set exogenously. The gauge theoretic revolution allows us to use covariant differentiation. And the difference in my mind, simplifying it, is really that we set the reference set endogenously. So instead of looking at an x-axis and a y-axis, we're looking at a base space and a fiber. But really what that's allowing us to do is it's allowing us to set the reference basket endogenously. And we're still just looking at rise over run. So it's calculus, it's just calculus where you allow your reference set to be determined endogenously. So when Eric and I started working on this, we started thinking about the issues with dealing with a static agent. And we developed a model to allow our agent to become dynamic, to allow for changing preferences, and to allow for, how do we deal with changing welfare given changing preferences? The hope is that we can start moving from thinking about agents to populations. So as a next step in our program, we would like to start shifting to static populations, and then finally the hope is to dynamic populations. What do I mean when I talk about thinking in terms of fields? Well, when we talk about probabilities, if we were to think about what is the probability of any individual belonging to a particular five-year age group, for example, in demography. If one thinks of it as a field, one can watch over time how our field changes, and we can watch this as a wave, and we can watch it propagate over time. Here we're back at 1900, we can see a baby boom, and we can watch the baby boom as it moves through. And as this thing goes through, what you'll see is that you have a secondary baby boom when we hit reproductive age for the first one, and we can track this as a wave over time, allowing us to see how it propagates through time. And the claim is this is true about preferences as well. If we think about Becker's point about preferences being completely unchanging and the same for all men over time, one has to ask how that fits with our concept of mimetic desire. And what I'm going to show you is most popular names by state for every year starting from 1960. And if one watches, we can see very clearly how we have Jessica becoming much more popular, Ashley taking over, Michael still taking over this part of the country, Ashley running Jessica out of town, and moving all the way through the country, even through the Rocky Mountains. So, in summary, going back to the questions that I asked at the beginning of the talk, what does our new economic thinking say about the mathematics of old economic thinking? And the claim is that we can superset that mathematics. We can include all of the mathematics of neoclassical economic theory as special cases, allowing us to have backwards compatibility with neoclassical economics. That rather than forcing us to choose between biology and physics, that we can begin to unite selection and field theory. That we won't have a fragmented system with one-off criticisms, but rather that we can build a unified structure which allows us to recover our economics in the various fields of economics. We will not be returning the same strong conclusions that neoclassical economics does, because this will be constrained by the mathematics and the science, rather than have the freedom to obfuscate given the kinds of mathematics that are currently used in neoclassical thinking. And rather than being more complicated, it will be deeper but less complicated. Looking forward, we believe that it will be centered around dynamic, uncertain, reflexive, geometric fields modeling real populations of market-building apes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have a few moments to questions or comments related
That Eric and I will take together.
Yeah, well, I just want to follow up on the question.
Sure.
The talk with them.
Yes.
The reason why I interrupted the hypothesis is very clear to understand what
Absolutely. Yes.
because I think your work is extremely deep. The question that I have is I'm trying to think also, building some type, the new economic thinking for me is like, going towards some type of relativity theory with respect to classical mechanics. The fact that everything we measure is relative, and there are two issues which I did not see appearing, although on private conversation with Eric, I know that you have that in mind, so I wanted to raise it and know how you fit that into your thinking. One is about the money, and therefore, the measure by currency. So, in fact, your measure, when you said you have those connections correspond to the equivalent prices, this is equivalent within one currency.
Yes.
They have a shift in one currency, shift another currency, and things can be very exposed. There is also amount okay. And the second thing is the fact that most of the transactions, and in principle, conceptually, you could say not most, but all the transactions are always the good versus the debt.
Yes.
That is, eventually you clear to debts, and but it's always a good versus a bad. We can, even if I buy you something, basically I can say, okay, I first take the stuff and then I clear the debt. So I can clear the debt immediately. I can pay with the credit card,
Yes.
just transferring that of the bank from me to you. So there is a dynamic of the debt, and those have a lifetime. They are in constant nominal amount for a certain period of time, and therefore they may change in value. You see, there is not a market, a continuous market that prices everything all the time. In reality, it doesn't work this way. So you have to include at some point this time lag with constant nominal value that you have. And that introduces another, I don't know, some kind of flea bracket that you have in this decomposition. Basically, the vertical space is okay, but the horizontal space is not so clear. I mean, it's like, that's why I'm comparing to relativity. It really depends on which differential you have. So I just wanted to see how you
Do you want to
with this one.
take that?
Essentially, two parts to your comment.
Yeah.
Yes. So just to start, let me say that the picture that I put up has to do with a very specific problem, which is how do you measure inflation over time? So the issue with currencies, I believe, does not come up when one is looking at the US dollar and trying to measure the US dollar over time. However, the next step, most certainly, is to think about how can we use differential geometry to keep track of currencies and look at the relationship between currencies over time. I believe one needs to introduce more mathematical formalism in order to do this. When Eric and I started working on it, we introduced the concept of time-ordered products, and maybe I will let you speak a little bit to that, and maybe to Raphael's next question.
Sure. So if you looked at bilateral trade, then you would have two currencies, and you would have imports and exports between the two. And so this forms a system where you're looking at 2x2 matrices for your inflation measures rather than 1x1. And because it's 2x2, you're introducing a non-abelian gauge field based on GL2R. And what happens is that instead of an exponential, which you would have gotten in a divisible, the thing that wants to be an exponential has to do with a Dyson perturbation series, and the only way of making it look like an exponential is to use time-ordered products, as Pia was saying. So there's kind of an amazingly cool thing that economics couldn't get to, and in fact, it's fantastic that Divizia in 1925 managed to come up with the trace of the geometry without seeing the geometry itself. So there's like an early precursor. As to the second point, there's definitely a problem about, it's like, particle creation, that where do new goods come from? So you can either play games by saying that you know, you have a conserved concept that ignorance is like potential energy for invention, and you decrease your ignorance as you increase your creation of new goods. You can think of it in terms of hedonics. This will not solve all your problems because there's still an idealization aspect. But the key point is to come up with a class of models which is true to the spirit of marginalism, which we've gotten comfortable with. And in situations where that's a bad approximation, you got to do some fancy work on the edge cases. So, you know, in the real world, not everything is differentiable. But we know in economics that that's one of the trade-offs that we're usually willing to make.
Let's take a few more questions, I believe.
Okay, that's fascinating. Despite Eric doing his best yesterday for a while, it's a great deal to take in. I'm sort of just trying to get a sort of overview for dummies like me. Is the general drift of this to replace a space of points with a space of functions, and then to build metrics on the space of functions, and can manipulate within that space and to work on manifolds within that space? Would that be a
Beautifully said. Yes. I think that, yes.
I think so too, with a lot of with the freedom that is intended, and also the knowledge that we know that the physical world works at an incredible level. And so the fact that there's this amazing coincidence that the formalism one place perfectly matches the formalism somewhere else without any kind of shoehorning, it's a great situation to be in. It's a cause for real optimism.
Yeah, Eric, you mentioned hedonics, and that's been I know that you had both of you had a history of tackling long-standing problems in the economic profession and applying different approaches. And when you mentioned hedonics, that's been another one. You know, clearly the issue of measuring productivity by the hedonic deflator. I'm wondering if have you thought about any new mathematical approaches which deal specifically with that problem, either of you?
We have. If you think about our patron here, his concept of reflexivity is really important to us, and it's not just about preferences, it's also about beliefs. So if one chooses to be as fair as possible to Dr. Becker, he would say that in some sense the preferences that are unchanging are on the underlying hedonics. But if you view red meat, for example, as something that is bad for your heart, or you view it as part of a paleo diet, that's a changing perspective on the hedonic interpretation of red meat, let's say. And so in some sense, what we see is that just as we are going to talk to you about preferences, there's an entirely analogous question about belief structures. And so to amplify George's point, you should be looking at markets to change our notion of our hedonic interpretation of goods. So it's both gauge theories on beliefs as well as on tastes. And I think, you know, if I tell you that Grey Goose vodka costs, I don't know, $80 a bottle, and something else costs $30 a bottle, and you don't know anything about vodka, you're going to impute a higher quality to Grey Goose in all likelihood because you're going to interpret something from the market. So it's very important to us that we begin with tastes, but we also move to beliefs, and I think that's a great place to take the hedonics.
In this formalism, what's the impact of the axiom of choice on economic consequences such as
Pricing.
The axiom of choice. Wow. I don't think we've thought a tremendous amount about.
in this formalism, what is the consequence of the axiom of choice in terms of, for example, the harm price of funding or the finance prices. So in this formalism, what is the consequence of the axiom of choice?
Well,
Go ahead. It's a deep question,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm not sure that we've thought. Yeah. Good question.
You started out a good friend in Chicago, but you have to remember that it's totally against the whole philosophical pie from Plato onwards. And I want to read you a very short. Man is said to be the same person from childhood until he advanced in years. Yet those two things at any time having a new person, not only in his body but in his soul. Or please never share abiding the same as particular self. From everybody else. So, you know, you've chosen that sort of the exception to the belief that people are constantly changing, modifying, being modified by the environment, by the market, whatever else, you know. So,
but isn't it interesting that that particular exception is the one that our field has gravitated towards, because it's the only one that allowed us to do the mathematics that we were capable of doing. And it was interesting for us when we started working on this that we were told repeatedly that the changing preferences problem had been solved by Becker. And it took us a while to find the quote and realize exactly how Becker had solved the problem.
Can I just add one thing? Yes. The marginal revolution you said. Well, after all, the marginal revolution is all about people having learned how to maximize sort of quasi-concave or concave functions on convex sets. But then you had a beautiful diagram of something which is very far from anything like a convex set. So the marginal thing, I think, at best could tell us something locally about things, but surely not anything global about it. So I wasn't quite sure how you reconcile your sort of gesture in the direction of marginal with a very non-convex sort of situation you step up there on the next slide.
I think that's a really good question. And I think when Eric starts talking about some of the more technical aspects of what we're doing, we will hopefully have a chance to see how, if I can preview a little bit, one can actually allow for changes over time if one allows for the concept of cardinal utility to enter without it actually affecting our long-term conclusions about where we end up.
I'm going to add one last remark. You started out with net trades, right? The diagram you had, where you had the origin and the things had to be what you call buffers.
Yes.
If anybody really wants to go see, look at the brother's proof of the famous Sonnenschein Mantel working, and he works all the time with your individuals, so just guys who make the right net trades, and then you add them together and you get exactly what you want. So those net trades have been around in economics a lot, and they're used a lot to get rid of some of these problems of income effects and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay, quick. Great to see a little applause from Sewell Wright. I'm another Sewell Wright fan. Do you hope this mathematics is going to be able? I mean, Sewell Wright presents some very challenging problems to us in just line landscapes. Is this? You're hoping this is going to? You're obviously optimistic this is going to help out.
I think the issue is that when you're dealing with evolution of creatures, we don't really have choice, and we don't really have a natural metric. And this is why the claim is that economics is the one place where one can actually start doing this with humans, if we think of us as being apes and representative of the biology. I think the challenge in biology is that it's going to be very hard for us to get something differentiable to actually be able to do any kind of calculus on.
I have to confess that I don't know anything about physics. I don't know much about biology. But I feel kind of a little bit strange when I'm told I'm forced to choose between the two. I don't want to choose between the two. I want to look at what are the economic problems I'm interested in. And if it so happens that there's a tool that fits, then I'm happy. And if it's been used in biology, you know, good for them. But it's not really a criterion that I care about. So, in some ways, I guess I'm not quite sure what is the question that you are addressing. If I ask, you know, what is the cause of financial instability, or how do we dampen the business cycle, or why don't people tend to save enough for retirement?
I mean, in what way does this help you?
Are you thinking
a very specific
example about indexing where you think this is useful?
Or are you
making a more general claim.
In which case, I'm still worried about having
Somebody say, here's a tool, you know, it'll fit no matter what your problem is.
So, given that I was here yesterday and Pia was not, we hear talks about things with inputs like taxes, inflation, growth, and from our perspective, very often these aren't even the right data types. They're not the right parts of speech. If we say that inflation is a field or a functional on a path space, right, and you're plugging in a number, a scalar, as if that's what inflation was, you should expect your models to go awry because it isn't even the right data type for the model. So what in part was to some issues that Perry was wrestling with exotic transactions on balance sheets. How do you account for things in a canonical fashion? Partially what we're talking about here is not having to choose. The idea that biology and physics share a tremendous amount in common, and that we in economics are in this joyful position of being able to study apes who have created an as-if physical universe in our markets. So I think that the point is most generally to think about all sorts of problems that we would like to address and to try to figure out what the most flexible dynamic data types are that take into account radical uncertainty, dynamism, heterogeneity, all of the points that Pia made at the beginning. And the claim is that the one place where we know that something like that can actually be done is geometric fields.
After Eric's presentation, so I say, I'm not.
And I'll make a very brief introduction for anyone who has tuned in to these presentations just now. Now we have Eric Weinstein, who will be speaking towards the mathematics of new economic thinking for reflexive markets.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. I think this is our first time really addressing an INET conference, and it's wonderful to have a chance to pick this up again. For those people following at home, let's use the gauged econ hashtag up here in case you're on Twitter, and maybe we can even find out if there are any questions. So I'd like to talk about, and I'm having a little bit of trouble here with this mic, is a mathematics of new economic thinking for reflexive markets. Picking up on where Pia left off, what are reflexive markets? We can ask ourselves, we hear about reflexivity, but we need sort of a more general understanding. And I would say that neoclassical economics assumes that minds move markets, and of course we would agree with that. But the question is, does it stop there? Is it really a unidirectional relationship? In order for us to consider a market to be reflexive, we must have an inverse where the market can move minds. And as we were just saying during the question and answer session, moving minds deals with both tastes and beliefs. And so whether those tastes are tastes over goods, tastes over risk preferences, whether they're beliefs about the underlying hedonics, what something represents, we need to have that ability or we can't, in some sense, close the system. Now, is that an exotic thing dreamed up by George Soros, or is this a generic thing found in the sciences? So the claim is that outside of economics, the fundamental sciences are generically reflexive. So let's figure out what that means. In the case of evolution, we have adaptive landscapes, right, which shape the species by telling what the opportunity set is in the system of selective pressures. But the species are not simply landscape takers. They create the landscape. And so in fact, there's a two-way interaction between the landscape and the species that inhabit it. In general relativity, when Wheeler had to give some sort of a prose description of Einstein's field equations, he said something quite beautiful. Matter tells space how to curve, while space tells matter how to move. So it's the interplay between the geometry and the flows that happen on that geometric arena. Similarly, after the revolution that began in Stony Brook in the mid-1970s, particle theory took on much the same characteristic, where fermions tell the gauge potentials how to curve. This time it's not a curvature of space and time, but curvature of some abstract mathematical space that we're still coming to grips with, called an auxiliary bundle. But gauge potentials create differential operators. So just as Pia was talking about reference levels and reference sets, we can think about something like the photon or the gluons as giving some sort of endogenous reference level where we can take rise over run and then use the ability to do differentiation in an endogenous context to propagate the matter in the system. So the claim is that everybody else is off being reflexive. This is a generic feature of the world, and these divisions are quite clean, they're quite meaningful, and the question is, can we get this into economics where it belongs? Because quite clearly, as I was saying with the Grey Goose vodka example, if I see something priced much higher than Smirnoff, I'm going to assume that it's a higher quality product. So how can economics ignore reflexivity if that's fundamentally what it means in some sense to be human? Now, if you think about what makes humans unique, we can say many things. We could talk about concealed ovulation. We could talk about persistent mammary glands, which is unique in the mammalian family. But if you look at something like brain-to-body ratio, we're really tricked out for software, for the ability to respond facultatively, as Pia was saying, to novel circumstances. We have an incredible ability. All of us are living far out of equilibrium with what may be called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or EEA, and we're managing fairly well. And how is this possible? It's because in some sense, we are devoted, at great risk, by the way, to our mothers who must push us out a few months early because our heads just won't fit out the opening. Humans are really extreme based on our extreme commitment to processing power and therefore not hard coding many of our behaviors. Our children, which are at the extreme of K selection, are basically helpless at birth, whereas a GNU or a horse must learn to function almost immediately. So the question is, what happens when a field becomes so wedded to needing to produce policy conclusions that it cannot fundamentally come to grips with the features that make us human? How human is Homo economicus? It's effectively denying the things that make us most human. And the problem is that we've become extremely isolated in the sciences. Economics is, in some sense, the whipping boy or the laughing stock of the hard sciences because it's willing to make assumptions that are known to be false. So this is Carl Christian von Weizsäcker, the son of the famous German physicist, and he wrote, "Traditional neoclassical economics has worked with the assumptions that preferences of agents in the economy are fixed. And this assumption has always been disputed, and indeed in the social sciences outside of neoclassical economics, the assumption has never been accepted by anyone." It's an extremely strong statement. One of the things that I find most bizarre entering economics without going through the sequence is that there's something about the introductory sequence that causes us not to think of this as a major assumption. Tastes remaining fixed, right? Or homogeneous agents. There's something about getting habituated to a completely wrong view of agents because the mathematics is capable of returning strong conclusions that does not happen if you do not go through the introductory sequence. If you come from math or if you come from physics, this strikes you as a sore thumb. It's very bizarre that somehow econ students have to be reminded that this is a strong assumption. Now, what is the problem? Why would we do such a thing? Why would we choose to isolate ourselves in this fashion? The problem is that this is kryptonite. Right? This is kryptonite for economics. If you start to deal with certain sorts of questions, the fear is that the theory will fall apart. And why would it do so? Let's look at a very simple problem. Imagine that you have indifference curves over two goods. And imagine that you begin consuming at a point A. The preferences do not change over time, but prices do. And you wander with your budget constraint and new prices down to the point B. You should be at least as happy, exactly as happy at point A as at point B, because they're both on the same indifference curve. Now there's a conspiracy, and the conspiracy causes prices and preferences to shift so that you remain at point B. You should be just as happy at the new point B as you were at the old point B, because nothing has changed in your consumption pattern and you're still on an ordinal indifference surface. Now prices change and your budget constraint changes, but your preferences remain the same in the new world, and you end up at point C. So you should be as happy at point B as you are at point C because you've only moved along an indifferent surface. The only problem is that you have a different measure, which is the fact that A and C happen to be collinear. And C is bigger than A, and so there's a different measure by which you should be happier with C than you were with A because there's just more stuff. If you don't want the stuff, you can certainly get rid of it. But the fact is that this is the sort of a thing that threatens to take down any notion of welfare. So as our indifferent surfaces change, and as our measure of the economy changes, we lose the ability to make strong responses to simple claims like, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, if my preferences didn't shift, maybe that means something at a consumer level. But what if they did in this situation? So let's think about this, not as economists often do, which is infrequently and treating it as a sort of a sideshow, but think of it as a central problem at the core of the theory that threatens like a rotten foundation in a building to bring everything down on top of it, right? What is the problem? So again, Karl Christian von Weizsäcker. The obstacle is the lack of an answer to the question, how can you do welfare economics if preferences change endogenously? After all, preferences of individual agents are the basic measuring rod of economic welfare, of performance generated in an economic system. How can we evaluate an economic system with a measuring rod that itself changes with the system? This is so close to Hermann Weyl's original definition of what gauge theory is. This is the gauge, the measuring rod in the 1917 theory. It is astounding that this has not been understood, given how, clearly a cry from the heart for some sort of a mathematics. As recently as 2006, we were able to find a quote making the definite statement that a time-varying objective function generally cannot be tracked by an economic index. In other words, if I look at something like cost of living, or a sophisticated measure of growth based on isoquants, the belief is that the problem is insoluble. If I allow the isoquants to change, if I allow for changing in different surfaces, the claim is that there is no means of doing this. It's not a question simply of searching for a means of doing it. It's supposed to be precluded. Certainly we can find evidence of this in the literature dating back to Fisher and Shell, and Arrow himself's original reaction to our work was that it couldn't be right because his point was that an agent evolving over many points of time was dual to many agents at a single point in time. And if you couldn't do, if Arrow's impossibility theorem precluded doing consistent welfare analysis over many agents at a single instant in time, it should be dual to the problem of one agent over many instants of time. But that's not true because of two things. First of all, Arrow's theorem was a theorem in social choice, not in markets. And second of all, if you allow that the agent, if we imagine some world in which I morph into Raphael and Raphael morphs into Pia, there's an extra bit of data, which is the path. And so it's the path and the fact that you're in a market that's going to change the situation and break the supposed duality. So I'm now working with Peter Thiel, and we're at a conference hosted by George Soros. And if there's something that unites right and left and great investors, it's distressed investing, looking for ideas where everybody feels sophisticated, believing one thing, and having the courage to believe something else. We all know what the zeitgeist is at the moment. It goes against math and against physics. The idea is that these have been tools to show off, to obfuscate, and to run away from the fundamental mandate of economic theory. But what if we were wrong about most of our fears about mathematics inside of economics? So let's go for the distressed long vol trade and take a contrarian position. First of all, what if there were a mathematical physical solution and it was conjecturally unique? In other words, let's imagine that some hotshot math student was able to prove that the solution that we put up that there is no other solution. Maybe there's a different way of finding the same solution, but then you would have a situation in which effectively the same techniques that are applicable in physics are forced on you by the problem because there isn't another way to skin the cat. Next, what if the physics formalism actually helped behavioral realism? There's a common canard that introducing physical type terminology is making the mistake of turning every human into a proton, right? But there's nothing about that. In fact, it's like saying that calculus developed for one purpose, let's say astrophysics, shouldn't be useful in building the smooth walls of a swimming pool. The formalism is the formalism, and as it was pointed out during the previous question and answer period, let's use everything that works well. What if more advanced math actually made life conceptually simpler? I frequently think about when I see somebody having Maxwell's equations tattooed on their shoulder, they choose 4 different equations that are complicated to remember, whereas most modern geometers remember one simple equation. It's not nearly so impressive. But in part, that would be wonderful to introduce mathematics, which were initially somewhat frightening, but that after a while became very simple and intuitive. What if higher mathematics made it easier to lock out those who would argue through special pleading? What if the sort of natural grain and the interoperability of the mathematics made it very evident when somebody was gaming the system or putting a shim in or trying to load the dice? And if it opened the door to reflexivity so that we could be in a more rich dialogue where economics wasn't constantly apologizing for itself to the harder sciences while beating up on the weaker social sciences. In order to get that way, and to get there, we have to talk about one abstraction that, if you haven't seen it before, may prove slightly confusing. But luckily, we have some option to visualize. So could I just get a show of hands from people? Who here has a good understanding of what a principal bundle is? Good understanding. Okay, so it's a minority of people even in this room. So fear not, C.N. Yang, arguably the greatest of our living theoretical physicists, had the following to say: since gauge fields, including in particular the electromagnetic field, are fiber bundles, all gauge fields are thus based on geometry. To us, it is remarkable that a geometric concept, not a physical one, a geometric concept, formulated without reference to physics, as it was in mathematics, should turn out to be exactly the basis of one and indeed maybe all of the fundamental interactions of the physical world. We're talking about a level of unification where there are certain leitmotifs that are so amazing that they appear to crop up over and over. So in my work, I'm interested in Riemannian geometry and auxiliary geometry, and I'm interested in unifying that with gravitational physics and particle theory, and the next stop would be economics. And the key point is that this is without question the best game as far as I can tell in town. It combines our 2 greatest tools in mathematics, which are calculus and linear algebra. And it's a leitmotif that seems to crop up over and over again, like Pia said with the monolith. So if that sounds starry-eyed or overly optimistic, let's take a look. So this is the Wu-Yang dictionary. And this was the shock of the news circa 1975 in Stony Brook, when Jim Simons, who somehow went on to become a multi-billionaire with an alternate successful hedge fund, sat down with C.N. Yang, and at a lunch seminar, they figured out that they had both created the same set of concepts with 2 different sets of terminology. So they created a dictionary between the 2 fields, and we've been living off the fat of the Renaissance from that meeting ever since. So the Wu-Yang dictionary is exactly what we're sort of looking for in this case with economics. The problem is that when you look up fiber bundle on the web, and I've complained about this before, you get something that looks like a Band-Aid ripped off of a hairy arm, which is not, in my opinion, particularly helpful. So the problem is that we're going to ask you to use your imagination with something that's very difficult to visualize. But when I say very difficult, it's not the case that it is impossible. In fact, there is effectively one picture that I can show you visually, so you don't have to learn any equations, so you will know what a principal bundle looks like. But the only problem is that you need 2 dimensions to get curvature in what we will call the base space, and 1 dimension to get the fiber in the fiber bundle. So this is probably the only picture you're ever going to get of a non-trivial fiber bundle. So if you've never seen it, here it is. The idea is you're looking at some absolutely tricked out version of the x, y, z space for doing partial differential equations. The circles represent the analog of the z-axis. And if you look at the space of all of these circles, there's a 2-dimensional sphere worth of circles. And the only thing that you don't see in this picture is that there's 1 point off at infinity, so that this isn't actually R3 filled up with donuts in 1 line. That 1 vertical line actually goes off to infinity and closes up and forms a circle. But you are now visually looking at the structure that amazed Yang, that was only discovered in the early 1920s. And if you want to cook your noodle, take a look at Planet Hopf, H-O-P-F, produced by Dror Barnatan of the university here. So the question is, how could a structure that looks this crazy have any relevance to economic theory? All right. The first thing is that the total space to begin with, that is the XYZ space analog, should be all possible cardinal utility functions. And we have to be a little careful. They should be all cardinal utility functions that are surjective on the space of positive cardinal utils. So every positive cardinal util gets hit. There are no bliss points, a bunch of stuff to spike out things that you might want to do to make the thing go wrong. So you take all nice increasing functions. The base space will be all admissible contour maps. In other words, just the indifferent surfaces that are gotten from taking the inverse images of a particular cardinal util under one of these functions. And the fiber will be all of the common utility hills that generate a common contour map. In other words, if I don't label the contours on the contour map, there are many different hills that could generate the same pattern in 2 dimensions. The group, and it's weird that groups don't really enter that much into economic theory, but that's got to change, and it should change right now, is the group of all reparameterizations of the positive reals that preserve orientation, which is very close to something that comes up in string theory under the name of the Virasoro group. So you've got a big infinite dimensional set with an operation called composition, and you can take inverse functions if the functions are all increasing. And that thing acts as the symmetries of your theory. So if you think about the circle being the symmetries of electromagnetism, or SU2, the effectively rotations in 3-dimensional space giving you the weak force, the symmetry here is an infinite dimensional, not a finite dimensional object. So here's what the principal welfare fibration looks like. The analog of the sphere in the Hopf fibration is the space of ordinal indifferent surfaces. The analog of the total space, which would be the 3-dimensional sphere, which would be the same as R3 plus a point at infinity, will be all admissible cardinal utility functions. And the analog of the circle, which would be the symmetries of the group, will be all increasing functions that map the positive reals to the positive reals in an invertible fashion. So the point is that this came to us from economics. It didn't come from physics envy. This has always been there. It's just that nobody understood it, we think, so far as we know, what it was, that it carried this extra mathematical structure. The problem is nobody knows how to define the horizontals to these circles. And those are the reference levels that Pia was talking about. So there is no means of doing calculus. It's like somebody presented you with some place to do calculus, but wouldn't give you a derivative. So the hope of doing marginal analysis in this space seems lost. But it turns out that there's an augmentation of the theory, and that is we're going to show that the Engels curves are exactly the right object to give you the ability to define differential operators on the space. So there are some preliminaries. We have to make, we talk sometimes about ordinal utility functions, but they don't really look enough like functions. They're just foliations with leaves of codimension 1. So in order to get something that looks like an ordinal utility function, you should realize that the indifferent surfaces are an equivalence relationship, and you should take a topological quotient, and that will be something like a copy of the real line. It just won't have any markings on it. And then you can map your baskets onto that thing, and you'll have effectively ordinal utility functions. So the idea is that a cardinal utility function composes with the ordinal utility function onto this quotient space, composed with a cardinalization function, which is, this is just foreplay to get you to where you need to go, to make cardinal and ordinal utility theory look similar. So then you deal with cardinal and ordinal cross sections, which are maps from either, in the case of cardinal, the positive reals back to the space of baskets so that the inverse composes to the identity. Sure. A cardinal utility function is a map from the positive orthant of a vector space of goods onto the positive real lines taken as positive utils. And an ordinal utility function is a map from a foliated positive orthant of V plus onto the quotient space, viewing the leaves of the foliation as an equivalence relationship allowing for topological quotient. You take your indifferent surfaces and you crush them so that it's the end.
This is the one that order process. This is you just have an electricity. That's order, but you don't know by how much. Another one you actually say numbers. Is that the difference?
Perfect. What he said. Our third collaborator, Victor. So now what we do is instead of taking the original ordinal and cardinal utility functions, we come up with cross-sectioned welfare fibrations. That is, a pair consisting of a cardinal utility function together with a cardinal cross-section, which is just what Victor was saying to us. And in the case of the base space, we do the same thing, but using the ordinal space of ordinal utils, which is just this quotient under the equivalence relationship of indifference. And then the group is just the positive, so diff 0 means positive, the connected component of the identity, so you don't want to allow a negative utility function where you get less and less happy the more and more you have, although maybe that would be kind of a Zen thing to do. And then just diffeomorphisms of R plus taken as positive utils. Now you need a G action, and you have to carry around this extra data, which is the Engels curve, which is the cross-sectioning of the indifference map. And you want it to be a right action. So the idea is that you act on the right with respect to the cross-section, but you act with respect to the cardinal utility function on the left via the inverse in the group. So the idea is that we would call both of these together a right action, and it's very confusing if you're not familiar with the mathematical terminology. This is clearly acting on the right, but something that acts on the left by the inverse we call a right action, just to make sure that neophytes are properly initiated. The projection map is then given essentially as a forgetful functor by ignoring cardinal labels, as Victor was alluding to. And on this bundle, there's a canonical connection. So maybe people can stop this at home when this is on the archive. But the point is that you got to do a little bit of fancy footwork to figure out what the tangent spaces are, to pull back bundles and sections. But it turns out that this extra little bit of information of the Engels curve means that when you pull back vector fields on the target, either positive real numbers as utils or the ordinal space of ordinal utils, then the idea is that you can expand that out if you know where the Engels curve passed through the foliation, cross-sectioning it. This solves the welfare problem for dynamic agents with evolving taste. So all the math stuff now gets very, very simple. The key point is if I have any path in the base, which is, let's say, given by prices and preferences, I can attempt to lift it non-uniquely into the total space, which is cardinal utility theory. Now, the good part about cardinal utility theory is that the changing preference problem has always been solved in cardinal theory, because I can compare 7 utils of happiness yesterday to 7 utils of happiness today to 7 utils tomorrow. So the cardinal label allows us to do welfare comparisons, but we don't tend to ascribe meaning to that. So what we need to do is we need to sneak into cardinal utility theory to do a welfare comparison, and then prove that if we had come in through a different window somewhere in cardinal utility theory, that there would have been no effect as long as what we do is compare welfare from one point to another. So effectively what you have some situation in which these solutions to the differential equation of parallel translation based on this idea of only moving by barters, in this case psychological barters rather than barters of baskets of goods, these solutions to differential equations have regularity imposed by this whole structure coming from the group. And so the idea is that if I want to take some sort of cardinal utility function and I want to compose it with an element of the group at time 0, baskets. So the point is that this quantity here would be G composed with C1 quantity inverse. When I take the inverse, I'm going to get a G inverse on the inside. And so this whole thing here will be the same thing as C1 inverse, where C1 is the cardinal utility function at time 1 on the parallel translate, composed with an initial cardinal utility function. So the idea is that whether I use C0 and C1, or I do a G translate and pick a different initial point at random, it'll always differ by an element of the group. And that when I do the comparison, the G and the G inverse are going to be on the inside. They're going to kill each other off, and it's going to matter not a whit as to which point I picked to represent my initial ordinal utility function. So the point is that we've made, it's like eating puffer fish. You've made it safe. So you get slight tingling on your tongue telling you that you went somewhere dangerous, but there's no lasting negative effect. The theory is entirely ordinal. Now, one of the things that I think is important is that INET needs to move where we start referring to each other's work and building on things and throwing out challenges, where we've had a couple of years where we've been talking about what's wrong. We need to set problems and tasks for each other. So we'd like to make a conjecture that we've just extended ordinal utility theory in contradiction of the claims that it can't be done. And the claim is that this is effectively unique, that if all you have are income expansion paths and tastes and a relatively smooth development over time, that there is a solution and there is no other solution available. That might not be true, but that's something that a bright math student or a bright economics student can work on and figure out, is there any way around the gauge theory? Further conjecture is that there are many welfare theories that require additional data. And my hope is that this is where George's interest in reflexivity might find a mathematical home, is that there may be only one way to do this if you're given no additional data, but part of the fun of physics is that with a relatively vanilla Lego set, we can build anything. Humans, posters, right? All of this is built out of physics. but we can do an infinite number of different games within physics, knowing how to work with the Lego bricks. So the point is that the space of solutions to the welfare problem is in one-to-one correspondence with gauge potentials, and that it sets up an opportunity for reflexivity, that you can have one thing like the Samuelson-Shepherd cost function being a section feeding back on the gauge potentials. And the corollary is that we can define dynamic cost of living. So as to yesterday's discussion, the key point is that inflation isn't what you think it is. It's an entirely different beast as long as you start to allow agents to be dynamic. So Dirac previously said what Pia was saying, that we should expect physics to work in any place that has been paved over with number. That's what economics is. It is the continuation of selection by physical means. And the next thing to do, if we can continue a program, is to set up welfare for populations under radical uncertainty. Fundamentally, this is not what gauge theory was meant to do. It's not about propagating point particles as dynamic agents. It's about entire fields. Because what these horizontal subspaces do is allow you to define differential operators which propagate fields, and that will be the mature realization. So I have a closing thought, because I don't know whether I'll be talking about this with you again. But it's worth realizing what this is. This stuff is really about the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. If you really look at what's at the bottom of theoretical physics, whether gravitation or particle theory, you see that it's a self-regulating system. And the key thing about the natural world is that nature never throws an exception. So if somewhere out there, one of you is designing a new currency, maybe a Bitcoin 2.0, which has an endogenous Fed, which is an algorithm, you're going to want a feedback system, probably, which is able to expand and contract the money supply. And you probably are going to want to have some terrific analytics on board so it can be responsive. So if there's some 14-year-old girl in Kazakhstan with a book on her bed and elliptic curves and how to program in Haskell or C++, I strongly encourage you to think about this. It may be that this is not meant for the macro community. The macro community seems to be very wedded to ideas that simply don't work. But as we've seen, you can release your own currency. You can start to build things on computers that were never in existence. And my hope is that you'll be able to route around the difficulties we've had and build something terrific. Good luck to you. Thanks.
Very interesting. But I'd like to share with you some concern I have because I've been confronted with gauge theory in physics early on and in finance early on also. So it was I think in late 90s. So I would say the history of the renewal of interest by physicists in so-called economic physics in the 1992, 93, and so the late 90s. And I've been confronted with several detail. I looked at the several claims of the application of gauge theory, for example, to extend option natural theory. And I think there have been several mathematicians frustrated theoretical physicists, let's say, who led the field and wanted to have a market. And the claims were huge, stigmatulous, but in my opinion, very hollow. So for the following reason. And it's an analogy, so when I clarify the position interest, actually this is interesting kind of reference, because it's already been claimed 10 or 15 years ago. So what I understand the logic of your approach is that one key aspect is that you show that neoclassical dynamics is a kind of special case of naturally operating more general gauge theory. That's an interesting statement, is there? But the question is, does it mean logically that gauge theory is the right framework to extend? So if I have a very simple, stupid counterexample, all let's say most mammals like honey, or all beers like honey. I like honey. Am I there? So the fact that there is a simplification, that there is a limit of the general theory that you can show works, doesn't mean that the general theory applies to the real world. And in the case of options, this was not really the case. So the game theory that was proposed for option actually were unable to make any significant prediction to, for example, explain why we smile, or quantitatively even do anything concrete in terms of the prediction. So that would be my concern, that the fact that you have a jump theory that recovers the neoclassical theory doesn't help us in any way in constraining how more general the theory should be. I have many other things to say, but that's a constraint.
So, sure.
On several occasions in the past, people have attempted to find one means or another to use gauge theory ideas as a basis to find out. So the results haven't been successful. I don't see what hasn't worked. But this doesn't mean that this time around it's going to be.
Thank you. No, of course. And the first one implies referees who criticized my own paper saying, oh, it didn't work before, so why should you, why you stop doing it? Obviously. No, my main point is the logical fallacies of because you prove that neoclassical theory is a special case of a larger theory, it logically follows that the larger theory is the right way to generalize. So that's completely.
All right. So first of all, I'm not here to make money. I'm here to lose money. This is time off from something I could be doing. When I saw these two claims, I think you're talking about, let me see who Ilinsky and another Russian. Yeah, one of them sold a book for something like $600, which I got free of charge. And Ilinsky claimed that that he was recovering something in option theory.
I mean, you can't see the special case.
Right, but I didn't see anything new. Right, so here's my claim. Define Lasper's conus changing preference cost of living. Can you do it? Right, so first thing people always say, there's like a reflexive, something that belongs to the spirit of our age is, what can you predict? It's not science if you don't have a falsifiable prediction. My first question is, can you define inflation? Can you define growth? No. We're in a very funny situation where we've given ourselves a pass where we don't even have a logically consistent definition. And we plug this thing in that we've ill-defined into our models. So it's very similar, if you will, to looking at the dressed electron as if it was bare and getting quantum electrodynamics not to make any sense. So the first claim is that right off the bat, I read your article as to whether gauge theory of finance make any sense. And you actually, if I recall correctly, were sort of wishing to be optimistic but disappointed in the particulars. So I would ask you to revisit the situation because this is a case in which we don't even have a definition. So there's plenty of situations where people are trying to predict the rate of inflation or they're talking about $1973. I have no idea what they're talking about because the most basic problems at the core of the theory haven't been solved. And the parts of speech, I don't think inflation's a number. I think it's involved with group elements. I think it's involved with fields. And I think that this is the first situation in which we can't yet quite figure out how to define inflation for population. So this is for dynamic agents. So Pia had this question about you could either make populations or go from static to dynamic, but eventually get to dynamic populations. So the claim is that I looked at those two things, didn't make any deep sense to me. Either it was trivial or it was incomprehensible. This is different.
Okay, just a question for Dominic. So I'm just trying to get an overview. So is it true that what you're doing is you're starting with some information or some sort of metric on you're transformations on those, shift them to a higher order. We can turn it into a mathematical object, and then you're using the inverse to sort of retrieve your original information or get back to your original space. Is that sort of how it goes?
Sort of.
Let me object to something. When you say we can't define inflation, I think that's wrong.
Right.
Defined is not interesting. But there is a very clear definition. There's a calculation of the CPI. There are other inflation indices that are defined. You can say it's not an interesting number, but that's a very different matter. My take on that is that what we're doing in all theory is that we're simplifying. And to my mind, inflation numbers, just like GDP numbers, are interesting for some purposes. GDP is not a measure of welfare. Some people think it is, but it's not. It's well defined. There are problems in some calculations. It may be there's some uncertainty about some numbers, but it's well defined. So I think the claim you're making is that the existing definition of inflation is not relevant for your particular welfare concern. And that is a valid claim. I think it's correct. I guess I'm not completely convinced that will give you something that as a macroeconomist will be useful for me for evaluating welfare. In fact, I think welfare economics is a bit of shambles. I don't know what we mean by welfare. I think we need to go beyond utility functions and take welfare theory maybe from a different angle. But coming back to this point, well-defined, it may not give you, but it's well-defined, and for some purposes, for a macroeconomist, it's a meaningful and a useful concept, just like GDP.
All sorts of things will break under stress. So I'm not claiming that if prices more or less go up together, that you can use any one of a number of different index numbers to take a measurement. But I am trying to say that if you fundamentally want to do something deeper, which is to have models that are built around the right data types so that you can have the architecture of the model guide your thinking, as opposed to say, we need an answer as to what's going to happen in the economy in a year's time. You will find that you will be humbled very quickly when you find out that inflation is most naturally a different sort of an object for a heterogeneous dynamic population.
You need to tell me right for what? What is the right measure depends on the purpose.
Can you focus on specifically
Sure.
on your theory in relation to inflation?
Sure.
I would support you against the micro. The number should be a multi-dimensional field that's very clear. When I see bubbles, I'm a special bubble. Not that is not a bubble. It's actually like inflation, which is multi-dimensional. But how do you characterize it? How is the structure?
I've been looking forward to meeting you for 2 or 3 years, so let's talk about that.
Yes, I'd like to come back to something that Pia has said. Also, Neoclassical makes very strong policy recommendation. I was wondering what you had in mind that Neoclassical theory was so well demonstrated.
I get very upset when I see somebody talking at a level of precision that presupposes a level of accuracy that isn't present. So when people are debating, for example, whether inflation was actually 1.3 or 1.32, and I don't think that they're even talking about the right data type, my feeling is that they are closetedly making the claim that they actually really know what they're doing to an extraordinary level of precision. And so fundamentally, I would much rather somebody say, here's the right data type, here's the uncertainty about it, and there is a model of last resort, which is what we do with airplanes. When we have a system that is vital to the airplane staying in the sky, we build tremendous amounts of redundancy. There might be 4 versions of an electrical circuit that would be a single point of failure. And so the point is, if you want to avoid heavy reserve requirements and redundancy requirements and contingency plans, you have to do real work. The problem is that you have this group of people who is constantly telling us that they know what they're doing at a macro level, and I'm just breaking with this. I just think it's nonsense, as do most people in the sciences, and we feel that we should be able to engage in a dialogue in which there is much more modesty imposed on the system.
You're back again with this inflation. How you measure inflation?
Well, for example, if you look at...
It has nothing to do with neoclassical theory. What kind of policy, this is the word that we're using.
When I look at models that try to tell me something about Europe, that have a very small number of countries producing a very small number of goods, and there's a policy implication. I mean, I don't really understand who these representative agents are. I don't understand sort of the intellectual framework. None of it looks like it's starting from what a population is, what an economy is. Maybe I just don't get it. But somehow it's important to me. And we dealt with the Boskin Commission. We found out later they had a 1.1% target because they wanted to save $1 trillion that they were going to back out over 10 years having to do with Social Security and tax receipts based on indexing tax brackets. So they came in and they knew what they wanted, and part of the group found a 0.5 and part of the group found 0.6, and they added them together and they got 1.1, and the recommendation was that CPI was overstated. Now, that's one version of getting it. But there's a science version of getting it, and the science version of getting it says that that's garbage. And it's fine if there's a policy group that says that all of this is fair game, but then the scientists, we're not going to be part of it.
Let's take one, two, one.
I actually just have a technical question. I was wondering, you introduced this snail shell shaped space. I think you called it the total space.
The total space of the hop vibration, that picture?
Yeah, is that the one that...
You got it.
Okay. That one, I was wondering, you said it's basically R3 with infinity additives, so kind of one-point convection.
Perfect.
So my question is, this is a topological structure, right? So you're starting to talk about derivatives on that space. Where do you get the structure from? You have to have some kind of curvature. I mean, how does it actually turn into an object of differential geometry rather than topology?
That's why the cross sections came in. It starts life as an object in topology, not geometry. So your point is very well taken. If I just did cardinal utility theory sitting over ordinal utility theory, I would have that kind of a structure, but the presumed inherited transverse to those circles wouldn't have existed. You would have pure topology and no geometry. In that particular case that you're looking at visually, you're looking at the points unit distance away from the origin in four-dimensional space, making a three-dimensional sphere, stereographically projecting it into R3. But that's not what we're doing economically. What we're doing economically is we're dealing with an infinite dimensional space, which I can't show you because your visual cortex and mine won't support it. But then I'm telling you that there is a transverse. It's not a metric, but it is an object in auxiliary geometry which has curvature, which is non-trivial.
So just maybe a follow-up on that. So what is the actual additional assumption or the additional piece of information that you put in there to get...
That you have an income expansion path in the form of an angles curve that snakes through all surfaces once and only once on its way from the origin to the basket at infinity.
So I think you guys are geniuses, but I want you to put your brain power in the right problem. So Raphael asked you a deep question, and you brushed that aside with things about fluidity. So I want to go back to that because so one of Minsky's criticism of neoclassical and generative all the results of in the absence of that commitment, and people saying and arrow for that. There's a reason for this, because that commitment is what means all the elements that you wanted, heterogeneity, you cannot aggregate the agents, the liabilities. The time dimension, the commitments you made in the past, by the cash flows that you did, as Perry was they determined what the commitment is going to be. Future radical uncertainty, because as Eugene would say, cash and control are the only weapons against the radical uncertainty. And then hoarding and what creates instability, financial crisis, depressions, recessions, and so on and so forth. So if you think that change in preferences in time is kryptonite,
dash is when, you know, the bad guys from Krypton come back and beat Superman to a pulp. That's where you want to.
And what you're pointing to, and this has to do with what Raphael was saying about prices don't always exist, is you're talking about some novel structures that haven't probably been developed in either mathematics or physics. What if there are sort of prices in some places where it is effectively geometrical, and then you have other regions in which it's topological? So the idea of a mixed bundle, which is partially geometric and partially topological because nobody has chosen to transact there or something, there's all sorts of amazingly cool stuff to do. But the key point is that we're picking off something clean, and we're trying to say, can you get excited about this? If you can't get excited about this, there's no point in going further and trying to develop the model. If you can get excited about this, then let's have a community and let's talk about it, because what we need to do if we want to unseat old economic thinking is build a rival structure that is backwards compatible so we can subset it, and also reveal that the assumptions were baked in. If you think that something is going to remain on a subspace and you let it sit in a larger space, that is a very strong statement about a vector field that never has a component going off of the subspace. If you think things are going to remain static, if you think populations are going to be homogeneous, you've got a lot of work to do if there are different options available in your space. So the whole question is, are you engaged or not?
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll get time for public records.
I'm afraid that this whole talk leaves me in this position that I'm often talk to Russian mathematicians. I asked Yuri what Igor was doing, and he said, very deep work, and so deep you wouldn't be able to understand. And I asked the opposite. When I met Igor and asked him what Yuri's work was, he said, very deep problem his own. Let me just put a very simple question, viewed as a primitive economy.
Спасибо.
When we're talking about changing tastes, which is a subject we just talked about. Now, most of us were taught what you have to think about is not preferences over current choices. You think about streams of consumption, right? So you have a singular space, and that's what you're thinking about. And then you have to sit here now and make a choice about that. So what does it mean to have changing tastes? My preferences over all the time now. How can I talk about changing tastes? Well, the only way you can think about it is get to the next period, and then what's happening out there, your preferences over there, have changed in some way. But in standard economics, you don't have a choice to make it. You don't have a chance to make a choice whatever. So I'm not really sure what we're talking about.
You're talking about a field. You're not actually making choices for your real self. You're talking about your belief about yourself. And so the whole point is that as I change, as I find out that I am not the man I expected to become, right? The idea is that I'm potentially going to make different choices because I've chosen poorly. But the whole point there is that I shouldn't have to be omniscient from the get-go. I should have a field concept of my future self, and I should deal with both beliefs and tastes.
That's exactly my point. So now I have so my future preferences. That seems to me so astonishingly difficult.
And if it is, then be humbled by it and say, perhaps that won't be computable. And in other words, it is entirely acceptable to us if when you're faced with the actual underlying problem, you say, that doesn't sound like something we could solve. And then we would say, bingo. Then don't have the confidence that you know what you're doing. Revel in your ignorance, accept your limitations as we have been forced to do in every other science, and join the fraternity of the other subjects.
So I'll give an example.
Thank you.
My name is Nasrin Kazanbek. I also studied at Harvard.
Yes, sort of.
Yes, I I said under producer Dobson, I said nanotechnology. I was wondering,
Oh, maybe you
my
want to talk to we can talk later. My question
this thing that you were talking, it could be this system, a cluster that they are interacting. But then, where are these entrepreneurs and disruptive technologies that they really?
Maybe I might introduce myself very quickly. Victor Yakovenko.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I'm at the University of Maryland. So I'm professor of physics. So of course I know about gauge fields. Sorry, you want to ask a question?
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
I'm with Travelers Insurance and I manage our asset liability risk for the firm. And inflation is very important to us. So I'm keen to understand how your new thinking on this, have you been approached by